end, we have a real treat this morning. Last spring, you may recall, Mr. Piper and Mr. Thompson surveyed boys in classes 4, 2, and 1 to help understand our students' experiences on the topic of interdisciplinary learning at RL. In doing so, they recognized the potential for greater synergy between the History Department's U.S. History course and the English Department's course in American Literature. From there, Mr. Service and Mr. Thompson proposed a 3-speaker Smith Scholar Series exploring the literary and historical elements of 3 enduring works taught in Class 2 English: the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, The Great Gatsby, and Song of Solomon. In November, you may recall, Yale professor David Blight spoke with us about Douglass's enduring narrative. Today, Harvard professor James Kloppenberg will speak with us about F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, a classic work that illuminates the decade of the Roaring '20s, a period currently being studied in our U.S. History course. Whether you read this book last year, are reading it this year, or will read it in the years ahead, the aim today is to bring to the stage a scholar who is passionate about this work, who will present an argument about his understanding of this important era, and who will provide an opportunity for discussion as well, both in this morning's hall and in further sessions with teachers and students throughout the morning. Dr. James Kloppenberg is a Charles Boren Professor of American History at Harvard University, where he teaches courses on American and European thought, culture, and politics. In recognition of his teaching, he has been awarded the Levinson Memorial Teaching Prize by the Harvard Undergraduate Council and has been honored 11 times by Harvard's graduating classes as one of their favorite professors. There is no one better suited to join us today. Professor Kloppenberg is one of the preeminent intellectual historians in our country. He's the author of 4 books and has published dozens of articles in journals and periodicals, including the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and Newsweek. His first book, Uncertain Victory, Social Democracy and Progressivism in European and American Thought, was awarded the Merle Curti Prize in Intellectual History by the Organization of American Historians. His book, The Virtues of Liberalism, transformed debates about American political thought by showing the ways in which American thinkers have drawn on and combined ideas from liberal, civic Republican, and religious traditions. Reading Obama, Dreams, Hopes, and the American Political Tradition, named the Book of the Year by PBS, revealed the roots of President Obama's ideas and the experiences and intellectual traditions that shaped his own sensibility. And finally, massive tone here, Toward Democracy, the struggle for self-rule in European and American thought, was awarded the George Massey Prize in Intellectual History by the American Historical Association. In it, Professor Kloppenberg argued that democracy is an ethical ideal rather than merely a set of institutions. And this could be more important for us, explains why democracy can thrive only when it rests on shared cultural commitments to equality, autonomy, and an ethic of reciprocity. Dr. Kloppenberg grew up in Denver, Colorado, where his parents owned a sheet metal shop in which he and his brothers worked on weekends and in the summers. It was during his undergraduate years at Dartmouth, where he played baseball and became passionate about debate, that Dr. Kloppenberg's burgeoning interest in history and politics took hold. After Dartmouth, he went on to earn his master's and PhD at Stanford. He has been awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim, Danforth, and Whiting Foundation, and has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And finally, Professor Kloppenberg is no stranger to Roxbury Latin. Not only has he spoken in this hall before, but he is also the father of Jay Kloppenberg, RL class of 2002. We are honored to have Dr. Kloppenberg with us today, not only to share some of the historical context of F. Scott Fitzgerald's great novel, but also to spend time in discussion with us throughout the morning. Please help me welcome back to Roxbury Latin, James Pop.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer, for that very generous introduction, and thanks to everyone who took part in getting me back to the one true school. This is not my first time on the stage, as Dr. Schaefer noted, but it is the first time since my son Jay graduated from RL in 2002. He lives in South Africa, where he and his wife, Kloppenberg established a secondary school, the African School for Excellence, in one of the townships outside Johannesburg. It's been a challenging but a rewarding life, one that answers the question his teachers here asked of all their students: how can you make the world a better place? I'm happy to be here during Black History Month. Yesterday I introduced a community reading of Frederick Douglass's great speech, What to the Slave on the 4th of July. Douglass claimed in that speech that the past is important to us only as we can make it useful to you in the present and in the future. I think he was right. That's why I'm here today. I want to make the past useful to you by talking about the 1920s and about Scott Fitzgerald's great novel, The Great Gatsby. I want to start with a question that my son Jay's 8-year-old daughter, my granddaughter, Tanda Lathan, asked Jay last summer when she told him that she was reading Alice in Wonderland. And he said, "Tanda, that's a classic." And she hesitated for a moment and said, "Daddy, what's a classic?" It's a great question. Is it a book or a piece of music or a painting that crosses eras, that lives forever? Is it Shakespeare's Hamlet or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or Mona Lisa? Or is it classic just what's taught in school? Is it a book or a piece of music or a painting that you are required to study? Or to suggest a third option, is a classic something that people return to again and again? Something that never gets old? Something like, say, Harry Potter, or Paul McCartney's song Yesterday, or a video of a championship by the Celtics or the Red Sox or the Patriots or the Bruins. I'll get back to that question, but I want you to think about how would you answer Tanya? What is a classic? There's another question I'd like to pose for you. Another question I'd like to ask you to think about. Before I do that, I want you to do something for me. Close your eyes. I know that's a dangerous thing to suggest early in the morning, but I'm going to risk it. Close your eyes. Think about the most beautiful person you have ever known, or even imagined. Your ideal partner. The person you would like to spend your life with. Who would that person be? What would make them special? The face, the eyes, the smile, the rest of their body? So linger on that image in your mind. Okay, you got it? All right, is there anything else? What about their personality? Are they fun-loving? Are they the life of the party? Or are they quiet, contemplative? Somebody who likes to ponder questions like, what is the meaning of life? And what about their character? Are they kind, warm, loving, generous? Think about it. Hold that image in your mind. Now imagine that that person, that paradigm, that person who embodies your ideal of physical beauty, irresistible personality, and admirable character, the person you would love wholeheartedly, completely. Imagine if that person falls in love with you. What would that be? Imagine the joy, the feeling of total happiness would sweep over your entire being. I suspect it might feel something like this passage from Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. It's about the moment just before the protagonist kisses her for the first time when he's falling in love with her. So he waited listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Pretty sweet, no? Okay, you can come back from the river. Now I want you to imagine something else. Imagine that all of that infinite, inexpressible, wonderful joy was ripped from you, that your dream exploded in an instant, just as it was becoming reality. Imagine that you and your beloved cannot be together, that you're being shipped off to another country far away from which you might never return, and that the love of your life is no longer available to you. That person, that most beautiful, most wonderful person, then goes off in another direction, forgets entirely about you, marries somebody else, leaving you alone and heartbroken. So the other question I want you to think about, besides Tommy's question, that's a classic, is this: what would you do to win back that person you lost? How would you go about it? How would you become so wonderful, so irresistible, that your lost love would willingly choose to leave everything and come back to you? What would it take? So that's my second question. What would you do? It's been a while since I've been here. Some things have changed. Tony Jarvis, a legendary head of school whose name adorns the factory, is no longer here. Most of Jay's teachers have retired. But some things remain the same. Some of those teachers, good half dozen, are still here. John Elliott is still looking over my shoulder as I speak. The chairs you're sitting in are as uncomfortable as ever. I assume you still sing the same songs, wear the same ties, and usually beat both Belmont and Knowles in the games you play against them. And there's still anger among you. Where are you, Alden? Anger. Okay, your Uncle Tim, whom I saw a couple months ago, said to me that I should say hello to you. When our son Jay was here, nobody would guess where he would be 25 years after I first spoke. You can't guess where he will be 25 years from now. I can assure you that I never imagined I would be where I was 25 years after I left high school. Especially when I was the age of U60s, but also when I was in 7th or 8th or even 9th grade. I was a pretty mediocre student. I never would have been admitted to a school like Roxbury Latin. I didn't like school much, mostly because I didn't like to read. I would rather have been drawing or playing football or basketball or baseball. School just seemed like a distraction to me from sport. So if some of you sometimes feel that way, let me assure you, it doesn't have to be fake. Only my sophomore year in high school did all that begin to change. And it changed for two reasons. The first was debate. I found out that I enjoyed the competition, doing research, writing outlines and speeches, thinking on my feet, provided a lot more satisfaction than I imagined that it would. It gave my work a focus, and at last I could see reasons for developing the skills of reading and writing and speaking, which end up being fairly useful in life. The second reason my attitude changed as a sophomore was Mrs. McDonald's American literature class. I still didn't care much for reading some of the longer books she assigned, including novels of Moby Dick. But two of the books we read that year changed my attitude toward reading. Although I still preferred sports to school, those two experiences were a spark. And from that point on, I began to take my schoolwork more seriously. I became a better student in high school, a better student still in college, and an even better student in graduate school. So now you're asking yourselves, okay, Professor Kloppenberg, that's all fine, but what does that have to do with those questions that you asked us to think about? Well, those two life-changing books are our main books being read this year by boys in Class 2. They are books the rest of you are likely to read while you're here, or that you have already read if you're seniors. Those books are Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. Huckleberry Finn took me to a completely unfamiliar world. As a boy, I knew very little about slavery and very little about race relations. There were very few black students in our local Catholic high school, and there were no black people working in my father's sheet metal shop, where his doctor I worked on weekends and summers. I thought very little about racism or about complex moral choices of the sort that Huck has to wrestle with in the novel. I never stopped to think that what people at one time considered good and right might eventually be seen as evil and wrong. Twain's novel presents the abominable system of race-based slavery, the system in which both Huck and his enslaved older friend Jim had to live, in just those terms. The dilemma Huck faces in the book awakened him to an unsettling reality. The moral frameworks that surround us, that shape our choices, do not always give us clarity about the decisions that we're forced to make. Sometimes the choices we face are more challenging than we've been taught to expect. When Huck decides he must help free the enslaved Jim, he knows what it means. He is certain it means he will go to hell. What Twain wants his readers to understand, though, was something very different. The gap between what Huck thinks at that moment and what attentive readers of the novel have learned about Huck, about Jim, and about the inescapable cruelty of slavery is what gives the book its power. It's the reason Ernest Hemingway once wrote that all modern American literature comes from a book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. It's certain that the book I consider the greatest American novel, Ralph Ellison's masterpiece, Invisible Man, would be unimaginable without Huck Finn. The other book that shifted my attitude toward reading novels is the most enduring of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novels, The Great Gatsby. By the end of my remarks, I want you to understand why I think it's a classic and why I think it will remain a classic. 8-year-old Hondo is too young to read it, and I'm happy that students at RL don't read it until junior year. Like Huck Finn, it appears to be a very simple story, and many readers never get beneath the surface to see the depths that make it more than just a charming piece of romantic fiction. It's a book I've now read more than 10 times, including just a year before I was asked to join you today. It's a book I find endlessly fascinating, a book that is richer for me every time I reread it. I'll explain what I mean by that. I keep returning to these books for a reason, and I'm going to explain what that is. But before I do, I want to locate the book for you in American history. The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, and its centennial last year meant that there was a flood of writing about it. It turns out that I read it about halfway between its publication and that centennial. When I turned 14, and it was 40 years old, in 1865. That's when I read it. I remember vividly how long ago 1925 seemed to me. My parents were teenagers then, so it shouldn't have seemed that long ago. But to me, it might as well have been 1825 or 1625. As I told you, I wasn't much of a student. I want you to go home today with a clearer sense of the decade of the 1920s than I had, and I'll try to do that by drawing some comparisons between then and now, between the United States of 1925 and the United States of 2026. What's the point of those comparisons? Does history repeat itself? Is it true that he who fails to learn the lesson of history is doomed to repeat it? I don't think it's that simple. Mark Twain likes to point out that a cat who jumps on a hot stove will never jump on a hot stove again, but neither will it ever jump on a cold stove. The point of that little anecdote might be that he who learns the lesson of history is doomed to misinterpret it. So I don't want you going home and telling your parents that some old history professor told us today that we're headed toward a Great Depression. But if you tell them that you heard some striking parallels between the Roaring Twenties and our own day, and if you can tell them about some of those parallels, that would be fine. First, the Roaring Twenties were All that because the economy was booming and many Americans indulged in a riot of unprecedented consumption. The preceding decade had seen more than 100,000 Americans killed in World War I and over 700,000 killed in the great influenza epidemic of 1918 through 1920. During the Red Scare that followed the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and the end of World War I, hundreds of Americans suspected of communist sympathies have been rounded up and sent to jail. That included Eugene Debs, a socialist who had run for president in 1912 and had received almost 1 million votes. It included innocent members of East European choral groups, everybody who was dining in a Polish restaurant, and others whose accents or appearances, in the words of one arresting officer, made them look like radicals. The insistence on what was called 100% Americanism meant that anyone other than white Protestants was suspect, and that included Jews, Catholics, Asians, blacks, and Latinos. That widespread suspicion culminated in the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, which for the first time in U.S. history severely limited or outlawed immigration from everywhere in the world except Northern Europe. The return to prominence of the Ku Klux Klan, not just in the South, but also in states such as Oklahoma and Indiana and Colorado, was another symptom of that rising intolerance. So were the race riots and the dozens of lynchings that marked the decade of the 20s as yet another in the cycles of violence against black people across the United States. Worries about the dangers of Demon Run, an often legitimate concern with the violence caused by drunkenness, often also masked anti-Catholic prejudice. That anxiety led to prohibition, which made alcohol illegal and drove drinking underground. During the 1920s, Protestant churches split in two. A new breed of conservatives called fundamentalists preached what they called biblical inerrancy and literal truth of the Bible. They insisted that because God rules the world, reformers trying to change it were doing the work of the devil. On the other hand, Protestant modernists studied history and argued that the Bible should be read metaphorically. They continued to preach what they called the social gospel, meaning that Christians should pay more attention to social justice than to lining their own pockets and leaving the rest to God. The former group of Protestants, the fundamentalists, condemned most of the changes that were happening during the 1920s. They opposed the changing behavior and growing influence of women who gained the vote in 1920, and they were furious about the increasing presence in America of ethnic and racial minorities. Immigrants had streamed into the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe since the 1890s, and blacks increasingly fled the Jim Crow South for northern cities where they hoped to find more opportunity and less overt racial violence. Conservative Americans, in short, demanded that the U.S. should return to its roots as a nation run by the white Protestant men whose ancestors had come from northern Europe. Today, of course, we have our own versions of those developments. We've had our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we've just recovered from our own pandemic, COVID-19. Roving bands of officials now round up, jail, or deport people who look like immigrants or sound like immigrants. One of the passages that we read on Sunday in the speech sticks in my mind. He said, in glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of forms of administrative law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive slave law, that's the fugitive slave law of the 1850s, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. In 2026, after the deaths of Ray Good and Alex Preddy, we have to ask ourselves, does that legislation still stand alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation? Today, critics of Israel are being branded anti-Semitic and told told to stop defending Palestinians. Successful women, black people, and other non-whites are said to have benefited from unfair affirmative action programs. Efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion are branded reverse discrimination and alcohol. We have our own version of the 1920s campaign for 100% Americanism. As was true in the 1920s, those who feel threatened by an increasingly diverse population demand that power be returned to those who should exercise it. Only with the return to white male supremacy will America be great again. So what drove that booming economy during the 1920s? There was a tremendous surge of consumption, frequently driven by the innovation of borrowing money and buying money. There was a culture tired of the reforms of the progressive era and enchanted by the latest inventions, automobiles, household appliances, and hungry for the gasoline and electricity required power. People in the roaring 20s were sure that those innovations would dramatically transform life as it had been known. They bought radios for their homes, enjoyed movies and lavish in theaters, and went to places like Fenway Park and Yankee Stadium to watch larger-than-life heroes like Babe Ruth or the latest football stars. And they began listening to a new music, that being the decade and other its many names, the jazz age. From its origins in New Orleans, jazz spread up the Mississippi River to New England, to St. Louis, and from there to Chicago, and now across to New York. The neighborhood of Harlem in particular became home to an explosion of music, dance, theater, and writing that expressed a new black sensibility in what came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. Women called flowers began wearing makeup, shorter skirts, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, exposing their knees while dancing the Charleston, and sometimes entering new worlds of work outside the home. Sexual mores were upended. Before widespread automobile ownership, unmarried women could go out with members of the opposite sex only when chaperoned. Once young people began driving around in cars, safe from the oversight of their elders, the rules governing interactions between men and women and between people of the same sex began to change. For every person who saw all of those changes as liberation, there were others who saw them as the work of Satan. Economic policies during the 1920s reflected the exhaustion with progressive reform and a widespread desire to return to what President Warren Harding called normalcy. Taxes on the rich were reduced. Tariffs rose, improving profits for American manufacturers without improving wages of struggling workers. Participation in the stock market skyrocketed, with much of the buying done on credit or on margin, as it was called euphemistically. Americans turned inward. There were to be no more demands for outreach to the rest of the world, no more reformers calling for heroic exertion, just a simple focus on enjoying life. But the sleazy, corrupt underside of that mood was exposed pretty fast. Members of President Harding's cabinet were convicted of selling government land to oil drillers for personal profit. And that was illegal back then. After President Harding died of a heart attack, he was succeeded by Vice President Calvin Coolidge, a former Massachusetts governor. Coolidge was a man of so few words that he was known as Silent Cap. At a dinner party at Smith College, he was seated next to a woman who said to him, "Mr. President, you've got to speak to me. I have a bet with my husband that I can get you to say more than 2 words." He paused and said, "You lose." Coolidge is also known for saying that the chief business of the American people is business, and his administration doubled down on Harding's pro-business policies. Taxes on the rich kept falling from 60% to 20%, and remaining regulations on business and banking practices were dismantled. The origin of buying was the result. New household appliances of all sorts, often bought on credit, began popping up all across America. Magazines, newspapers, and radios screamed the news about fantastic new consumer products that could be bought on credit. Vacuum cleaners and refrigerators promised to banish forever the drudgery of keeping the home clean and food fresh. Department stores, mail order catalogs brought an even dizzier variety of consumer goods. Escapism seeped into popular culture in cartoon prototypes for our own superheroes, including Space Explorer, Buck Rogers, and Tarzan the Ape Man. The quintessential figure of the 1920s, though, was Charles Ponzi, who invented a get-rich-quick strategy that spread through legitimate as well as crooked financial institutions. It worked like this. You lured investors by promising astronomical returns on investment. Then you used that money to lure other investors, whose investments you used to pay yourself a fortune and to pay out to the first investors just enough to feed their hunger for the greater return that you promised but never seemed to deliver. The suckers for such schemes were not hard to find in the 20s. The same logic of getting something for nothing enticed many people who bought stocks from credit. They assumed that they could pay off their loans as their stocks continued to rise. In 1929, all of those bubbles burst at once. The stock market crashed, banks closed, millions lost everything they had purchased or invested on credit. Millions of others lost their jobs. Once the roaring 20s vanished into the Great Depression, it turned out that progressive reformers' regulations on buying, banking, and investing had been necessary safeguards for ordinary people, not unnecessary obstacles. Does any of that sound familiar in the 2026? We now have new toys of our own, from our portable phones, laptops, our tablets, to all the apps that run and all the games we can play. We have a new marketplace, Amazon, where we can buy anything we can imagine from the comfort of home. And with the help of Amazon's algorithm, we can be enticed to buy plenty of things we didn't even know existed. We have a new technology, artificial intelligence, that promises to transform life as we know it. The big tech companies are investing billions of dollars to build the infrastructure for AI, which is gobbling up unprecedented amounts of electrical power, even though nobody knows for sure whether it will offer just faster versions of Google or revolutionize everything. We have our own tax cutting, tariff raising, and regulation bashing administration, in which pay-to-play and praise and announcements of personal and family gain have morphed from evidence of corruption to signs that favored insiders have mastered the art of the deal. Making a profit from serving in government is now no more problematic than lying about the result of an election or storming the Capitol with the reverse result of an election. Our own economic boom is fueled by the lavish spending of the upper 10% and even more lavish spending of the upper 1%. Investment houses looking into their crystal balls at the start of this new year see only further payoffs for the well-to-do, while they note almost parenthetically that lower income households may experience issues of affordability. That's a lovely way of saying the rich will get richer and the poor will not. And Charles Ponzi, the New York Times published a detailed account last month of how Jeffrey Epstein got rich by luring wealthy investors to giving their money to invest and persuading other people to give him their money because other rich people had given him their money. Even before he bought his island, Epstein had made himself rich by absconding with the money of dull rich people, so eager to get even richer that they failed to see or chose not to see the rot eating away beneath the road. Okay, I hope you have at least some sense of the 1920s and that you're aware of some of the echoes of that decade in our own day. Perhaps you're willing to consider another of Mark Twain's adages. History never repeats itself, but it does rhyme. Now that we've passed the halfway mark of our own glory days, do you think any of those rhymes are becoming easier to keep? So now let's return to the question I asked you to think about, which I'm going to address last by turning to Fitzgerald's novel, The Gatsby. First, a few words about Fitzgerald himself. He was raised a Catholic in Minnesota, and when he arrived to study at Princeton after high school, he found himself a complete outsider in the world of wealthy, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I expect some of you might feel like outsiders here. I know I did when I arrived at Dartmouth College from my little Catholic high school. Fitzgerald never really felt part of the social scene in Princeton or in New York. After the war, he moved to Paris. That part of Woody Allen's movie Midnight in Paris is actually fairly accurate. Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda were friends with Ernest Hemingway, and other writers and artists on the left bank of Paris. Like them, he was disillusioned with life back in the U.S. The writer and critic Gertrude Stein told Hemingway that they were part of a lost generation. And that's another term that sticks back, that is stuck for this generation. In the first of Fitzgerald's novels, This Side of Paradise, he had one of his characters lament that his generation had grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faith in man broken. Or as Fitzgerald wrote to a friend from Paris shortly after Great Gatsby was published, I carry New York around the world in my heart, but sometimes I try to shake it off in my dreams. Nothing happens to American art, because America is the story of the moon that never rose. America is so decadent that its brilliant children are damned almost before they are born. America was hopelessly parochial. Quite a few Americans went to Paris to find something more cosmopolitan than the nation of prohibition, Ku-Klux Klan, and frenzied consumerism. So that's a bit of context for the circumstances in which Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. For him and for some others in the lost generation of writers, it was a time of excess, but also a time of disillusionment, frustration, shattered dreams. As I said at the outset, I think there are three ways to answer Condo's question: what is a classic? Let me address those. Some people, notably the 19th century English poet and essayist Matthew Arnold, and the 20th century poet and writer T.S. Eliot, have argued that a classic is a work of art that transcends its time and place. In Arnold's phrase, it is the best that has been thought and said. Something that all people, once they become familiar with it, will recognize as exceptional. That's what distinguishes a classic from anything else. So classics include works of Shakespeare, Beethoven, Leonardo da Vinci, works that continue to be treasured because they are quite simply the best that has been thought or said or composed or painted. The second answer to Condo's question is quite different. According to this view, a classic is nothing more than what teachers choose to assign. These choices change over time, and they vary across cultures. There are no works of art that transcend particular moments or judgments. It's all contingent. Qualities that people like Arnold and Eliot hold up as characteristics of classic are simply those that people educated at places like Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Yale simply think of as the best. Their teachers have read such books in high school or college or graduate school and have been told over and over again that they should admire book A, symphony B, painting C. They continue to pass along these references as if they had something more going for them than that they keep being taught. A celebrity is defined as someone well known for his well-knownness. Then a classic is a classic because it continues to be called a classic. From this perspective, nothing distinguishes a Shakespeare play from a superhero movie except the pedigree. This way of looking at things, a classic just reflects elitist biases that keep being perpetuated for no good reason. The third answer to Condo's question, which is less universal than the first but less specific than the second, is that a classic is something that you return to again and again. You return to it not because you're forced to, not because you think that's what will make you a cultured, educated individual, but because it gives you a kind of satisfaction that you can't find elsewhere. On this line of argument, we attend performances of The Tempest by the Royal Shakespeare Company, or we listen to the Hamlet Haydn Society play Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, or we trek to the Museum of Fine Arts to see a portrait by Rembrandt, because we find such experiences rewarding, valuable, for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons we can articulate, as we do when we explain why an astonishing performance brings us to tears or makes us laugh out loud, how a particular crescendo gives us chills, or when we note the extraordinary way that light glimmers off coat or color in the painting. So the other reasons are harder to explain in words, but I find them no less valuable, even if they are inexpressible because they exceed our language. I had a teacher in graduate school who used to insist that any book worth reading is worth reading twice. At the time, I and my peers scoffed at that idea. We were reading so much, so fast to get ready for our comprehensive exams. It was hard for us even to imagine lavishing the attention necessary to reread books that we are already familiar with. I admit that I've read thousands of books that don't necessarily repay reading twice. There are plenty of valuable books like history, besides my own discipline, that have given me a deeper understanding of the past that I couldn't have gotten any other way. Some of those have proved to be worth rereading. Others, not so much. What did I mean when I said that some books that to me are classics, change each time I read them? After all, the words on the page are fixed, the books will turn out differently, yet the experience of reading, of absorbing not only what's happening, but how the author or the composer or the painter tells the story, makes it happen, and reflecting on how I understand exactly what I'm experiencing. That continues to change. As I said, I first read Huck Finn and the Great Gatsby when I was 14 years old. I've reread them at different stages of my life since then. I taught Huck Finn and Gatsby at Harvard for many years. And every time I did, I found something in them that I had not seen before. Sometimes because a student would see something that I had missed. Just as I've had countless experience over many years and have met countless people and read countless essays written by my students, sometimes about these books, the way I experience works of art changes each time because I have changed between reading them. I have new knowledge. I have seen, felt, loved, and regretted, and yearned for new things, new people, new experiences. And all of that shapes who I am when I read a classic, or when I hear or see what I consider to be a classic. The category itself might not change, but what I decide to return to, and what I decide not to return to, might change, because I'm looking for something different, or I might be open to something. My point is there are several different ways to define a classic. Mine is just one of those. You will find your own. Rereading, or re-listening, or re-seeing is hard for all of you to do now because your teachers keep you too busy. But try, make an effort. And I urge you to trust your teachers. They know what they're doing. They assign books that are worth reading, even if sometimes you won't see why the first time you read them. All of you but the 60s will remember when Amanda Cook gave the commencement address here last spring. She works at the publisher Random House, and she pointed out that the big tech companies devote millions of dollars to figuring out the best ways to rob us of our attention. They want to distract us from what we might be doing by feeding us an endless supply of candy or candy to get us to do what we don't know we shouldn't be doing instead of what we should be doing. But as she said, we have to work to control our attention. We have to develop the way we develop our bodies. That gets harder and harder as we go along, but I advise you, as she did, to resist those temptations, to be in charge of your attention, despite all the energy and ingenuity being devoted to stealing from you. Okay, finally, to close it to my other question. What would you do to win back the love of your life? That, I want to assure you, is the central question in the book. It is what makes the book a classic, at least for me. I won't spoil it for you by telling you what Fitzgerald's answer is, but I do want to say there is no more urgent question in your life. When I asked you to think about the qualities of your ideal partner, I was surreptitiously asking you to think about what you value in a person. What qualities of character matter most to you? You can't do a whole lot about how you look, you can't even do much about your personality, you can forge your character. That's what you're doing every single day, through every choice you make. In the end, that will prove more valuable to you and to the people who love you than anything else. The Great Gatsby is also a profound meditation on the gap that can exist between the surface, how we look, how polished or funny we are, how smart we seem, and the depth of our character. And that's what the novel tries to do, is get beneath the characters of the 1920s and to see the strengths and weaknesses that were displayed during that decade. All of it portrayed in language that cloaks its lyricism beneath a mask of social realism. Part of what I find moving about the book is that every character, in his or her own way, is possessed with a sort of yearning. For some of them, it's a religious yearning. For others, it's a yearning for just the simple stuff of prosperity. Fitzgerald captured that yearning in the final paragraph of the book, in which Nick sits on the North Shore of Long Island and reflects on what happened that year, how everything unfolded, how everything unraveled. Then he puts it all in perspective by imagining the first Dutch sailors who saw this new world. Fitzgerald's words: "For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired. Face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder." It's dazzling prose, and there are equally dazzling sentences throughout the novel. The question Fitzgerald was asking is, what would these new people do with the land that for thousands of years had been inhabited by people who saw the earth as their mother and the resources that surrounded them as part of the world that sustained them, not as resources to be developed, to be plundered, as were done by European settlers. One of my son's favorite teachers at RL, an English teacher named Joe Carter, who clearly you know, used to call himself a collector of sentences. He had his favorites, I have mine. You'll have yours. When I told my son I was going to give this talk, he reminded me of Joe Carter's self-description as a collector of sentences. He told me that one of the sentences he collected was the final sentence of The Great Gatsby. Jay and I were surprised when both of us together on the phone from Massachusetts to South Africa spontaneously and simultaneously recited that sentence in unison. Like many people, like Joe Carter and Jay and I both consider this sentence a classic, and I want to conclude with it this morning. Here it is. "And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." I appreciate your attention and your willingness to consider the questions I asked you to think about. Now, if we had time, I would say it's your turn. I assure you that all questions are good questions, and whether my answers will be answers, I will have to be honest.
Thank you, Professor Kloppenberg, for that far-ranging and deep exploration of what it is we do here. Which is learn and ask questions and make connections, think about what it means to be human, how we can express that. Thank you very much. We have a lot to think about. Class 2, I will remind you, we will stay here in Rubenir for further time with Professor Kloppenberg. We are blessed by Professor Kloppenberg. That, I